How to knit. Measuring your gauge. For this tutorial, you will need a ruler, some T-pins, a pair of knitting needles, and a ball of yarn. Special thanks to our sponsor UU for providing today's yarn. Today we are using their woolly worsted washable 100% merino superwash yarn in the color Cotton Candy. Today I'm going to show you how to measure your gauge. Now, you may be wondering, what is gauge? And gauge is the number of stitches that you knit per inch using a particular type of yarn and needle combination. Now, usually your ball band will give you an average gauge for the yarn that you're using, and it will say what needles to use in general to get that gauge. But that doesn't always work out. And sometimes your stitch gauge will work out differently than your row gauge for your project. Now, gauge is important because you want to meet gauge in order for your fabric to fit you properly. This is very important when it comes to fitted garments like sweaters and hats, and sometimes things like mittens and socks will also be important to get gauge on. So, to measure gauge, we do a few different things. First, we're going to make a gauge swatch. Now here, I've done a flat stockinette swatch. I've bordered it with some garter stitch around the edges. And this will make sure that we have a nice flat section here in the middle to measure from. Now, I've also wet blocked this swatch as well. If you are using acrylic yarn, that's not going to help you too much because acrylic yarn doesn't really block very well. But that's going to help even out the stitches and let them set in and bloom in the way that they will when the finished garment is finished. So to measure the gauge, we're going to use a ruler, and here I've got a vintage sewing and knitting gauge, and I'm going to use some pins here to mark the stitches, our stitch inches, to help get an accurate reading. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take one of these pins here, and this is just a regular T-pin, and I'm going to place the pin right in between one of these stockinette rows. Okay, and we want to make sure that we're pinning in between the rows where the arrows are pointing down. So this is just to give us a nice place to measure accurately from. Now we'll take our ruler, and you want to use a flat ruler, not a measuring tape, because the measuring tape can stretch and that will throw off your gauge measurements. So here I've got my end of my ruler right at the T-pin, and I'm going to place my other pin at the 4-inch mark. So that's right here, and it's very important to place it right at the 4-inch mark. Some people will do it off of 2 inches or even 1 inch, and it's better to get a larger sample because you're going to get a more accurate gauge reading that way. Now, by placing it right at the 4-inch mark, you'll be able to see if you're at a quarter of a stitch, a half stitch, 3/4, or a full stitch. So here I happen to be at right about 3/4 of a stitch. So I'm just going to place my pin right there. And now what I can do is I can actually measure, I can count the number of stitches that I have in between these two pins. So let's do that real fast. Looks like we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18 and 3/4 stitches. So what I do next is divide those stitches up between 4. So what I do next is divide that stitch number 18.75 for 3/4 by 4. And what that will do is that will give me my stitches per inch. So now I'll have 4.68 stitches per inch. Now obviously I can't really use fractions of a stitch in my finished pattern, but I still want to remain using that fraction of a stitch for my gauge, because I'll multiply those out over the stitches needed for my pattern. Now that might not make a lot of sense to you right now, but let's use an example. Say we are going to make a blanket, and the blanket we want to be 30 inches across. Say it's like a child's blanket. We will then multiply our 30 inches by 4.68, which would give me 140.4 stitches. And that will let me then round up or down to make sure that I can meet that length. So I know now I'll need to cast on about 140 stitches to get a 30-inch piece of fabric. So we're going to want to do the same thing for our row gauge, and that is the individual stitch rows that we do going up. And that will be important for some patterns as well. So to do that, again, we're going to mark a stitch somewhere in the middle here, and we're going to just find where the top and bottom of a stitch meet and place a pin there. Then it will use our ruler once again. Here I've marked it to 4 inches, and we'll start there. Place that right up against there, and we can see I don't quite have 4 inches there, so what I'm going to do instead for this is I'm just going to start right where the stitches begin, and it looks like we have exactly 4 inches along the vertical section of this fabric. Okay, so that's nice because that means we can just count all of the rows. So we've got 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, 22, and 24 rows per 4 inches. So again, we'll do some quick math. We've got 24 rows, and we'll divide that by 4. 24 divided by 4 equals 6. So that means that we have 6 rows per inch. So if we wanted to make our little blanket square by 30 inches, we would times 6 by 30, and that would equal 180 rows. So we would need to knit 180 rows in stockinette flat in order to equal 30 inches. So that's how we measure our gauge for both stitches across and rows vertically to help you get more accurate measurements when making fitted garments. Now this will also help you when translating some of the stitch patterns on our website into other projects, particularly blankets and afghans. You can then take your finished math and make sure that your number of stitches equals the multiples for the project that you're using. So say you had a project that had a cast on of 3 plus 2. That means you would multiply your cast on by 3. And we already know that we would have 130 stitches for 30 inches. We divide that by 3, and we see that we get 43 repeats, which wouldn't quite work. So we would try 43 times 3, and that would give us 129, plus 2 would give us 131 to make the pattern even, and that would give us almost exactly our 30 inches. So that's how we would adjust a stitch pattern for using our gauge. So there you go. If you got any questions, let us know in the comments or email us at info@newstitchaday.com. Want more New Stitch a Day? Join our VIP email list at newstitchaday.com/VIP.